Excellencies, distinguished guests and delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the plenary session of the Finance in Commons Summit. I hope that you enjoyed your day. I know that many crucial issues and solutions have been discussed with enthusiasm and conviction throughout the multiple sessions. It's the first time ever that public development banks and their partners, as well as all stakeholders involved in financial development, were gathered together to address some of the most pressing challenges of our time, including the achievement of the Sdgs by 2030. Since yesterday, we've heard more than 130 speakers who have covered a large range of topics, but all quite interconnected, from post-COVID recovery to climate and biodiversity. Well, Rémi Rioux, let me remind our audience probably who is here with me on the set. So Rémi, you are the CEO of the Agence Française de Développement, the AFD, and chairman of the International Development Finance Club. So Rémi, this is an exciting time for the AFD and for all the banks gathered here today. So you must be quite delighted actually by the fruitful exchange of ideas that have occurred so far, and by the acknowledgement actually that came from such diverse organizations.
I'm elated, Asha, by our achievement. We gathered for the first time this year the whole family of 450 public development banks from every region in the world, operating at local, national, regional, international, multilateral levels, ranging from generalist to specialist institution supporting SMEs, agriculture, housing, trade, international cooperation. This diversity is really our strength. And today, we decide to form a community for action. 20 vibrant events these last hours on key issues, climate, energy transition, social investments in times of COVID-19, biodiversity, gender, private sector in Africa, many others. 2 high-level panels to move forward with our shareholders and with our stakeholders. So we want to do more, we want to do better, we want to do together with the private sector, with civil society, with local authorities, with foundations, to unleash our full bridging potential. And now this is the plenary, so we will very carefully listen to heads of state, to leaders, listen to their expectations and how they react to our initiative. So really eager to hear them all.
Yes, thank you, Rémi, and looking forward. So let's now watch the video address from the primary supporters of this movement of change.
Mesdames et messieurs, je suis très heureux de participer aujourd'hui, même par ce truchement d'une visioconférence, à la première réunion jamais organisée réunissant toutes les banques publiques de développement du monde et tous leurs partenaires. Parce que nous avons tous compris qu'il nous faut changer en profondeur et reconstruire, c'est une initiative forte et utile. J'en félicite les organisateurs et tous les partenaires du sommet Finance en commun, en particulier la Fédération mondiale des institutions financières de développement, les banques multilatérales partenaires et l'International Development Finance Club que préside l'Agence française de développement à l'origine de ce sommet. Nous venons avec plusieurs autres chefs d'État, avec le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, la directrice générale du Fonds monétaire international, la présidente de la Commission européenne, de débattre et de dégager les principes d'une action internationale renouvelée et renforcée pour dépasser cette crise et changer ce qui doit l'être dans nos façons de produire, de consommer, de coopérer, pour que les liens sociaux et l'environnement soient préservés, protégés, reconstruits. Dans la continuité de cet échange sur les principes qui doivent refonder le multilatéralisme, nous avons tenu à participer au sommet Finance en commun pour passer à l'action en mobilisant le plus fortement possible nos banques publiques. Ce sommet est une preuve. Une preuve que notre transformation est possible. En vous réunissant aujourd'hui, en faisant émerger une coalition inédite par son ampleur, sa diversité et son rôle de plateforme entre tous les acteurs financiers, vous venez nous rappeler qu'il est possible de construire des réponses communes, cohérentes, concertées aux grands défis globaux. Votre présence à tous l'atteste. Un consensus profond existe sur l'urgence de combattre le dérèglement climatique et sur la nécessité de construire un monde plus juste, équitable et durable. Mais aussi sur la nécessaire complémentarité de ces agendas. Nous ne pouvons plus parler désormais de trajectoire de développement sans prendre en compte les impacts du changement climatique. Nous ne pouvons plus agir pour le climat sans prendre en compte les inégalités sociales. Il y a quelques jours, les États-Unis sont sortis officiellement de l'accord de Paris sur le climat. Le résultat des élections ouvre la voie à un retour au premier jour. Nous l'avons souhaité. Dès les premières heures, vous le savez, nous nous sommes battus pour cela. Et c'est la preuve qu'il fallait tenir bon face à tous les vents mauvais. Je me souviens des One Planet Summit, du G7 de Biarritz, du sommet Action Climat de New York en septembre 2019 et de tant d'autres réunions internationales organisées depuis 3 ans pour sauver notre capacité d'action collective. Nous y sommes parvenus. Il y a quelques semaines, la Chine a confirmé sa disposition à avancer conformément aux engagements pris. L'Union européenne prendra dans les jours et semaines à venir des décisions structurantes pour elle-même. Le 12 décembre, jour du 5e anniversaire de l'accord de Paris, sera le temps de la clarification, des engagements tenus et à venir. Soyons collectivement au rendez-vous, maintenant, plus que jamais. Make Our Planet Great Again est une possibilité, pas seulement dans les mots, dans la réalité. Ici, il ne s'agit plus de rechercher un accord international, nous l'avons trouvé il y a 5 ans déjà, avec l'accord de Paris sur le climat, celui de New York sur les objectifs de développement durable et à Addis Abeba sur le financement du développement. Non, il s'agit de passer à l'acte, de passer à l'échelle et d'entraîner avec nous tous les acteurs de bonne volonté. Je suis donc heureux de voir qu'aujourd'hui, à ce moment très précis de notre vie internationale, vous venez vers nous avec la volonté de financer en commun nos politiques et notre transformation. Avec la capacité d'agir à tous les niveaux, multilatéral, international, régional, national et local, puisqu'il existe des banques publiques de développement dans chacun des pays du monde. Avec la volonté de répondre en même temps, dans chacun des projets que vous financez, aux enjeux environnementaux et sociaux. Et avec l'ambition de démultiplier les 2300 milliards de dollars que vous investissez déjà chaque année en agissant comme des plateformes dans chacun des pays, comme le G20 l'a appelé de ses vœux. Ce que vous êtes en train de créer, c'est une nouvelle infrastructure financière publique globale qui n'avait jamais été conçue à cette échelle et dont nous avons tellement besoin aux côtés des budgets des gouvernements et des outils des banques centrales. Une nouvelle infrastructure capable de relancer l'investissement public de façon contracyclique pendant les crises et d'accélérer la mobilisation de la finance privée au service de l'accord de Paris et des ODD. Une architecture capable de mobiliser l'épargne partout où elle se trouve dans le monde et de l'orienter plus efficacement là où sont les opportunités d'investissement les plus prometteuses, au Sud en particulier. Une architecture capable de stimuler les investissements de développement durable. Je vous invite à faire entendre votre voix plus fortement, distinctement dans les débats internationaux, une voix concrète, constructive, entrant en dialogue avec celle tout aussi essentielle des collectivités locales, des financiers privés, des entreprises, de la société civile, des philanthropes. J'y suis particulièrement sensible, car les banques publiques de développement ont joué un rôle majeur dans l'histoire économique de la France, et elles sont aujourd'hui aux avant-postes face à la crise de la Covid-19 et pour la transformation que j'ai engagée depuis plus de 3 ans. C'est en France qu'est née en 1816 la plus ancienne banque publique de développement du monde, devenue le groupe Caisse des dépôts et consignations. Et dans la crise que nous traversons, ce groupe s'est immédiatement mis au service de la relance et consacre une part importante de ses fonds propres, à hauteur de 26 milliards d'euros, pour que la reprise économique soit la plus rapide, la plus responsable, la plus durable possible dans de nombreux domaines comme le logement ou le soutien aux entreprises et à l'économie, le renforcement de la cohésion sociale et bien sûr la transition écologique et énergétique. Avec la Banque des territoires et BPI France, ce seront plus de 40 milliards d'euros consacrés à la lutte contre le changement climatique d'ici à 2024, en changeant d'échelle sur de nombreux sujets qui permettront de réduire nos émissions de CO2. Il n'y a donc aucune fatalité et ce groupe aide un écosystème d'innovation en matière de développement durable pour qu'il se structure et pour avancer aussi en matière de prêts et de fonds propres. C'est au service de la France et de l'Afrique qu'est né également à Londres en 1941, fondé par le général de Gaulle pour être la Caisse de la France libre, la plus ancienne banque publique internationale du monde, le groupe Agence française de développement, au service du climat, de la biodiversité et des ODD, en Afrique, dans le monde émergent et dans nos outre-mer. Ce groupe œuvre pour un monde en commun et atteint 14 milliards d'euros de financement annuel en 2019. L'AFD ira plus loin dans l'appui aux politiques publiques de nos partenaires avec l'entrée d'Expertise France dans le groupe AFD. Et je remercie aussi l'AFD d'aider à faire de Paris une capitale des solutions pour le développement durable, avec toutes les institutions internationales qui y résident et avec notre place financière à la pointe du combat pour la finance verte et durable. Je veux enfin souligner le rôle important des banques publiques de développement dans la nouvelle étape de la construction de l'Union européenne. Je sais que la BEI, la BIRD, la Banque de développement du Conseil de l'Europe et les banques publiques de différents États d'Europe ont participé très activement à vos travaux. Elles sont engagées avec force pour soutenir le Green New Deal européen et dans la coopération internationale, en particulier avec l'Afrique. Avec nos partenaires européens, nous allons transformer, renforcer la BEI pour en faire une véritable banque européenne du climat, renforcer la force de frappe des banques européennes de développement en structurant un système d'action plus lisible, plus articulé, plus coordonné. Voilà, vous l'avez compris, nos banques publiques proposent aujourd'hui de contribuer à engager une nouvelle étape du développement de nos sociétés, faite de respect, de coopération internationale, d'engagement de chacun de nos États, le local, le national, le régional aussi, du productif au social. Nos banques nous proposent au fond de relier, de réconcilier comme jamais les échelles d'espace, de temps et la cohérence d'une action pour aider au développement durable. En insistant sur notre devoir de solidarité et le souci des plus pauvres dans le monde comme dans chacune de nos sociétés. Alors, je souhaite vraiment longue vie au mouvement Finance en commun que vous lancez tous aujourd'hui. J'accueille très positivement la force de vos engagements collectifs et ferai en sorte que vos travaux soient reconnus et encouragés au plan international à l'occasion des grands sommets 2021 sur la biodiversité, le climat, le financement des économies africaines, l'égalité femmes-hommes, la sécurité alimentaire. Je souhaite en tout cas que vos travaux puissent nous éclairer au G7, au G20, mais surtout puissent changer concrètement la vie de toutes celles et ceux à qui elles se destinent. Changer la vie de chacun, permettre de la rendre meilleure. C'est notre objectif à tous. Je vous remercie.
Chers collègues, mesdames, messieurs, alors que tous les pays continuent de subir de plein fouet les effets néfastes de la pandémie Covid-19, ce sommet des banques de développement est assurément opportun. Je félicite le président Macron pour cette excellente initiative. À travers le monde, plus de 450 banques de développement investissent environ 2300 milliards de dollars par an, contribuant ainsi à améliorer les conditions de vie de milliards d'individus. L'effort est considérable, il faut le reconnaître. Mais pour une meilleure efficacité de leur action, les banques de développement devraient davantage améliorer leurs mécanismes d'intervention par la simplification de leurs procédures et formalités, aider à une évaluation plus juste de la perception du risque d'investissement en Afrique pour réduire les primes d'assurance indûment élevées, assurer une meilleure coordination de leur intervention de façon à faciliter l'allocation optimale des ressources dédiées au financement des grands projets de développement. Enfin, accroître les financements concessionnels en faveur des États et surtout des PME, PMI qui constituent des acteurs clés de l'économie des pays en développement. Le Sénégal s'est engagé dans cette dynamique en 2014 avec la création de la Banque nationale pour le développement économique, essentiellement en soutien aux PME-PMI. Devant une conjoncture d'une sévérité inédite, c'est toute la philosophie du financement du développement qu'il convient de revisiter en profondeur afin de l'adapter aux besoins et aux urgences pour ne pas juste faire du business as usual. C'est la valeur ajoutée que le Sénégal attend de ce processus préparatoire pour faire du sommet de Paris sur le financement des économies africaines un succès à la hauteur de nos ambitions. Je vous remercie.
Excellencies, we have unprecedented circumstances as we confront the devastating economic and social crisis unleashed by the COVID-19 pandemic. What began as a health emergency has evolved into a multi-headed threat to global stability and sustainable development. In Costa Rica, as in the other countries, current figures predict a negative effect on the progress made in the last 5 years towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This, as a result of a rise in the unemployment rate, low domestic production, slowdown in the quality of unemployment, impacts on education, financial fragility, and other structural challenges. In realizing the hard conditions to be faced in the short and long run, we have taken resolute steps to protect small and medium-sized enterprises, current employment, and their potential to generate new business. The National Development Banking System has put forward very concrete and specific measures to ease the impact of COVID-19 in the key industries such as tourism, commerce, and transport. And at the global level, existing and underutilizing policy options have been presented in order to provide governments with the necessary funds to respond quickly and sufficiently to the emergency needs, while avoiding unsustainable debt levels and crippling credit ratings such as special purpose vehicles, repo facilities, and our own proposal, FACE, a support fund to alleviate COVID economics. FACE will catalyze approximately 0.7% of global GDP channeled through one or several multilateral development banks, which could lend concessional finance and investments to provide extraordinary financing to the developing countries that had limited policy tools to respond to the crisis, and to keep them on track to fulfilling 2030 Agenda and the Sdgs. Besides urgent resource mobilizations, fixing market distortions, and transforming stagnant conceptions, such as income per capita classifications, are also necessary to ensure that recovery actions consider country-specific contexts, needs, and vulnerabilities. No country should be excluded from fair finance for development. Engaging credit rating agencies and expanding the debt service suspension initiative and other debt service initiatives to include middle-income countries are necessary to avoid unfair ratings and unsustainable debt levels. Costa Rica also advocates for alternatives to invest in resilience and thus build back better, to make sure that our response to this crisis is aligned with our sustainable development goals and commitments, especially through nature-based solutions, blue and green bonds and debt swaps for nature and climate, and creating innovative mechanisms that support developing countries in the accelerated implementation of development goals. Additional liquidity and fiscal space to strengthen and expand the protection and economical stability are required. This could be enabled through speedy and flexible financing, the formation of partnerships, and the strengthening of international cooperation, which are key in addressing the challenges posed by the sanitary emergency and by the SDGs and 2030 agenda. This crisis gives us a unique opportunity to define actions and seek solutions in line with sustainable development from a multi-stakeholder and multi-level approach, putting people and nature at the center of progress and well-being. Only through strengthened cooperation and a focus on solidarity, we will be able to set ourselves on the path of inclusive, green, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Quiero empezar agradeciéndole al presidente Macron y al secretario general de las Naciones Unidas esta oportunidad de poder darles la visión que tengo sobre lo que el mundo está viviendo y sobre lo que la Argentina está pasando. En verdad, todos somos testigos y actores de un tiempo singular que fue el tiempo de la pandemia. Fue un momento difícil en donde muchos tuvimos que ir caminando a ciegas frente a un virus desconocido que enfermó a muchos y también se llevó la vida de muchos. En Argentina trabajamos cuidadosamente y denodadamente por eso. Nuestro primer esfuerzo fue precisamente garantizar que el sistema de salud nunca estuviera saturado a la hora en que llegaran los contagios. Y ese objetivo lo logramos. Pero no fue suficiente, porque con una economía que se paralizaba, no solamente a nivel mundial, sino también en la Argentina, debimos trabajar mucho para garantizar la sostenibilidad social de la Argentina. Y así fue como desarrollamos programas para los sectores más desprotegidos, asistimos al trabajo y a la producción para que el empleo registrado no se perdiera. Trabajamos codo a codo con las organizaciones sociales para preservar a los más humildes. En ese mismo contexto, tuvimos que resolver los problemas que heredamos como gobierno. Una deuda con acreedores privados que era definitivamente imposible de pagar y que logramos que ese acuerdo se concrete. Y ahora, el inicio de una negociación con el Fondo Monetario Internacional que aspiramos llegue a buen puerto. En este tiempo que se inicia, los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo que apoyaron a la Argentina hoy tendrían un rol más crucial en la reconstrucción. Complementariamente, la banca pública para el desarrollo está llamada a jugar un papel central en la reconfiguración de un sistema sociopolítico y productivo más inclusivo y más sostenible. El Banco de Inversión y Comercio Exterior de la Argentina financiará en la próxima década un mínimo de $500 millones hasta 2023 en proyectos que impactarán positivamente en al menos 11 de los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sustentable. Eso incluye el trabajo decente y el crecimiento económico, la industria, innovación e infraestructura, la reducción de la desigualdad, más igualdad de género, el agua y el saneamiento de ella y el combate definitivo a la pobreza. El tiempo que empezamos a transitar nos enfrenta al dilema si la nueva normalidad se parece más a la normalidad que vivimos hasta aquí o va a ser distinta. Nosotros estamos aspirando a que haya otra normalidad. Una normalidad más inclusiva, una normalidad que a todos los contenga. Una normalidad que acabe con los desequilibrios y la desigualdad que hoy vivimos, que permite que unos pocos tengan mucho y unos muchos tengan poco. Este es un tiempo en donde nos salvamos juntos, mancomunadamente. La palabra que rige este tiempo se llama solidaridad. Muchas gracias.
Congratulations to President Macron and to Rémi Rio for bringing together public development banks in this Finance in Common summit. It takes place during extraordinary times when we are striving to overcome the worst recession since the Great Depression. We have seen massive actions taken by fiscal authorities and by major central banks. They have put a floor under the world economy. But the road to recovery is going to be steep. And we would need massive investments in human and physical capital. What would be the quality of this investment would determine our future. And you, public development banks, have a major role to play to help the recovery, but also to overcome the vulnerabilities we had prior to the pandemic, when we experienced low productivity, low growth, high inequality, and a looming climate crisis. The focus in the future ought to be not just to boost growth, but to make sure that growth is sustainable and inclusive. Let me make 3 points about your role. First, you send an important signal to markets by adopting environmental, social, and governance standards, and by boosting finance through green bonds, through investments in sustainability. You have a powerful, massive capacity, over $2 trillion coming together. How you deploy this capacity would determine to a very great degree whether we are on a transformative path to greener and more inclusive growth for the future. Second, during times of uncertainty, you can take more risk. But it is so important that you do it with strong accountability to the taxpayer who underpins your financing, that you strengthen governance and you fight waste through high quality of the investments you support. Last but not least, you can remove barriers for private investments. We know from our analysis that $1 invested by the public can unleash up to 10 times more in private capital. And what is so important is that you concentrate on what would matter the most: digital infrastructure, clean energy, and investment in skills that are the skills of tomorrow. Let me finish by offering IMF's full support to the policies that you embrace in your joint declaration. You commit to sustainable and inclusive development and to making sure that the Paris Agreement is one that would define our future. We are fully aligned with you. Thank you.
Dear President Macron, presidents of public development banks, dear Rémi Rio, I am delighted to address the opening of the Finance in Common Summit. The COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed the worst global health, economic, and social crisis in recent history. Developing countries are among those hardest hit. According to the 2020 OECD Global Outlook on Financing for Sustainable Development, 90 out of 122 developing countries are in economic recession. 90 out of 122 are in economic recession. And we estimate that the annual SDG financing gap in these countries could increase by about $1.7 trillion in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. Now, to shift this balance, we must leverage billions from public aid and trillions from private sector finance. Public development banks are particularly well placed to do this, working between public and private finance, as well as domestic and external finance. However, governments must also be on board to truly harness this potential. The policies and the unprecedented stimulus packages that OECD countries have implemented in response to the pandemic have gone a long way to tackle, the more immediate, the more obvious, we could call them the more emerging challenges. But similar efforts should also be mobilized to support more sustainable, more inclusive investment and finance. In this respect, by next year's Paris Peace Forum, the OECD will be developing a health financing diagnostic to support governments in strengthening the financing of health systems. This tool aims to help governments focus their reform efforts on more resilient, more sustainable health systems by identifying key bottlenecks within their health financing systems. Monsieur le Président, dear participants, the Finance in Common Summit and its declaration demonstrate our collective commitment to strengthening the multilateral system and building back better. You can count on the OECD to continue working with you and for you to achieve a strong, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. Governments and businesses around the world are continuing to respond to the immediate and acute challenges posed by the COVID pandemic. But we know that the climate crisis has not taken any time off. We must ensure that the global recovery delivers a greener, more inclusive and more resilient future for all our peoples. One that delivers on the commitments of the Paris Agreement and meets the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to congratulate President Macron and Secretary General Guterres for their leadership in holding this event, the first ever global summit of public development banks. Finance has a pivotal role to play in tackling climate change. The IPCC estimates that limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees would require global energy investments of around $3.5 trillion a year until 2050. And public finance has a crucial role to play in stimulating private investment. Last year, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced a plan to double the UK's climate finance commitment to £11.6 billion over the period 2021 to 2025. And we call on others to match that ambition. The OECD has estimated that climate finance from developed countries reached $79 billion in 2018, up 10% from the year before, and that bilateral and multilateral public finance has increased by 64% since 2013. This shows progress, but there is much further to go. Donors must meet and surpass the goal of mobilizing $100 billion a year. And our COP presidency will focus on working with others to mobilize funds and improve access for adaptation and resilience. Before COP26, we need to see all the public development banks coming forward with clear plans, including target dates by which their operations will be fully aligned with the Paris Agreement. The Finance and Commons Summit Declaration will point the way forward for our work, focusing on the green recovery and accelerating progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And on the 12th of December, the UK, the UN and France will co-host a Climate Ambition Summit in partnership with Chile and Italy. And I invite leaders to use this as their opportunity to announce new commitments under the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation and support. Working together, we can deliver the greener, more inclusive, more resilient future that we all want to see. Thank you.
Honorable President Macron, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The coronavirus pandemic has hit our people and countries hard. As we recover from this crisis, it remains paramount to protect people's lives and livelihoods. This is why we need to push forward with putting a global recovery initiative into operational effect to bring about sustainable growth that is also digital, socially fair and resilient. The EU has worked to shape ideas around such a process, notably in the United Nations work on financing for development in the age of COVID-19. Working together as Team Europe, the EU and its member states, along with financial institutions, have been leading the international response to the pandemic. The European Union plans to spend an unprecedented €1.82 trillion to make the economy greener and more digital as part of a recovery that is inclusive and lasting. Collectively, however, we need to make a greater effort. This is where the public development banks come into. With activity amounting to around 10% of the total investments in the world, they play a vital role economically, for example, by investing in the green economy. This is why, in Europe, national public development banks and international financial institutions like the EIB and EBRD play a major part in putting the EU recovery response into effect. In this, our objectives are the same, and so we support the powerful coalition of public banks that is now taking shape on a global scale. But this is more than just a vision. Concretely, the EU comes with the financial firepower of the European External Investment Plan and European Fund for Sustainable Development. And today, in the margins of the summit, we concluded guarantees that will leverage €10 billion and bring much-needed investment to partner countries in Africa and the EU neighborhood. We will extend this to Latin America and Asia in the EU's next financial cycle starting in 2021. The EU and its member states are committed to further scaling up mobilization of international climate finance. It is important that multilateral development banks adopt responsible investment policies and phase out financing of fossil fuel projects, particularly those using solid fossil fuels, while taking into account country-specific energy needs. But the public purse cannot pay the bill on its own. While the public finance needs to lead the way, the private sector needs to provide the scale. The EU has developed several innovative instruments for sustainable finance that it can offer to the world. I'm thinking particularly of the first ever green list classification system or taxonomy that investors can use to identify economic activities that benefit the environment. Public development banks should consider using it too, for example, when they issue green bonds or assess projects. Similarly, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance provides a multilateral forum for policymakers developing sustainable finance rules. The platform has members from all continents. I'm happy to see that the IMF joined as an observer, along with the EIB and EBRD. We would welcome the participation of more countries and public development banks as well. It is already exchanging best practices, working together to identify barriers and opportunities regarding sustainable finance. We are stronger together. We should unite at this summit to link investments with the green, digital and sustainable agendas so that we all emerge from this crisis in a lasting recovery. Thank you.
A very warm thank you to Emmanuel Macron, the President of the French Republic, for demonstrating his full and strongest endorsement of this collective dynamic initiated at the summit. And equal thank you to the heads of states, government and institutions officials who have shared their enthusiastic support to the Finance in Common Summit. Thank you to all of you who are supporting this coalition building and who are following the discussion from all around the world. Well, it's now time to discover the commitment of the PDBs, the public development banks. In a hopeful and galvanizing video, you will witness their pledge to building a common and sustainable response to global challenges. Take a look.
La pandémie de Covid-19 a des répercussions profondes et durables sur la planète et les populations.
Ello nos lleva a repensar y a considerar los aspectos ambientales y sociales en nuestros modelos de producción y consumo para construir sociedades resilientes.
Disruptions generate opportunities for major transformation.
Marapat dito ay ang pagtatayo natin muli para sa tama at para sa ikabubuti ng lahat. Ang pagdisenyo ng pangmatagalang pantay at sama-samang pag-unlad para walang sinuman ang maiwan sa atin.
We, public development banks of the world, gathered for the first time in Paris, commit to support the transformation of the global economy and societies to achieve the climate and sustainable development goals.
Finance is a major trigger for change. The time has now come for coordinated action of all global finance players.
ولا بد أن تكون القرارات القصيرة الأجل متوافقة مع الأهداف الأطول أجل.
As public development banks, we have always been active in times of crisis, catalyzing sustainable finance on a global scale.
We are operating at local, national, regional, international or multilateral levels. And our diversity is our strength. We have a unique role and responsibility in the financial system.
بإمكاننا تقديم استجابات عاجلة ومعاكسة للتقلبات الدولية، وإننا نسعى إلى تحقيق أهداف طويلة الأجل للحد من أوجه التفاوت وحماية كوكبنا وتعزيز التنمية المستدامة.
We want to contribute to reorienting global finance.
We PDBs have a concrete roadmap to respond to the crisis while saving the Sdgs.
We hereby commit collectively to shift our strategies, investment patterns, activities, and operating modalities accordingly.
Para sa malaki at makabuluhang epekto,
we also commit to join forces and form a global coalition of all PDBs around the world.
We will work together as a community among ourselves
and as a system with all stakeholders.
We welcome government support and measures aiming at unleashing our full potential
para servir mejor a sus políticas.
And also call on all stakeholders to finance in common,
to increase cooperation, partnerships with us,
to better support collectively the global agenda.
Well, to complement these statements, I would like to welcome a few of the key stakeholders who were featured in this video. So please welcome Mr. Thabo Taman, the CEO of Citizen Entrepreneurial Development Agency from Botswana and Chair of the World Federation of Development Finance Institutions. We also have His Excellency Dr. Hajar, President of the Islamic Development Bank Group and 2020 Chair of Heads of MDB's meetings. And we will, of course, listen later on to a message from Mr. Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. And of course, I still have Rémi Rioux with me, the Chairman of the International Development Finance Club. So, Mr. Taman, Dr. Hajar, welcome. So my first question, Mr. Taman, I will start with you. So as Chairman of the World Federation of Development Finance Institutions, we would like to hear your views on this declaration.
Thank you very much, and pass my sincere regards to Remy there. I wish I could be there. My viewpoint is that in terms of from the ADFI's viewpoint, this summit must come up with recommendations on how to fast track, achieving the SDGs and Paris Agreement climate finance agenda. I think it's very important that this is fast tracked, and we need to support the mobilization of resources for development and channeling more resources to less developing economies, particularly in Africa, given the high level of social and economic crisis of the continent. And I think capacity building and a combination of different financing products, blended finance, for instance. And I think it is expected that this summit will come up with an approach on how the multilateral development banks, that is the MDBs, can work better with our members, ADFI members, at national level in promoting and financing SDGs and climate finance. I think overall, we need to build stronger partnership and alliances with development banks across the world. And I think, we need to come up with steps in making sure that we appeal to the MDBs and other bigger DFIs to work with the national DFIs at various countries of the world, especially those less developed countries, in promoting that development financing activities in those countries, particularly in the water sector, sanitation and, health sector and infrastructure development.
Thank you, Tabu Taman. Rémi, probably could you share with us and the audience what are the main takeaways of the declaration?
I'm very proud of this declaration.
You can be.
On climate, the whole community of PDBs commit to align with the Paris Agreement. We will support the long-term trajectories to reach carbon neutrality and set explicit policies to exit from coal in the perspective of COP26. On biodiversity, full support to COP15. We will protect nature, but also provide biodiversity positive actions all along value chains. On social, promotion of universal health coverage. We will explore One Health approaches, increase social investments and mainstream gender in all our operations. And last but not least, we commit to rights-based approaches, common standards to better work together. So you have reference to about 20 internationally agreed texts in the declaration, which is the first time for such a large group. So in a word, this is a renewed support to multilateralism.
Thank you, Rémi. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Dr. Hajar, as 2020 Chair of the Heads of the Multilateral Development Banks meeting, what is your message to our Assembly?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. I am honored and proud to be here with all of you. Allow me first to commend Rémi and the AFD team for tremendous work and efforts to deliver this very important gathering. As a multilateral development bank, which means we are owned by a multitude of countries by definition, and we naturally finance in common. First, having our conversation today is timely. COVID-19 accelerated the impact created by emerging changes and challenges at the global level, and even if the pandemic puts us all equal in front of the threat, it has proven that a lot more needed to be done to achieve strong resilience and economic empowerment. Development and peace and stability go hand in hand together, that they cannot be achieved if some are winning while the majority are losing. We all need to support development models where everyone wins and economic growth benefits everyone while safeguarding our planet. This coalition we are building today comes at the right time to fight for improving the lives and livelihoods of the most vulnerable people. Second, what should we do now? Joining force is the first step, and I'm very pleased to see that the Finance in Common Declaration has been signed by many partners, including sister MDBs, that I personally invited to support this gathering at its early stage. Though it is correct to say we all public development banks, we need to look beyond our group and beyond public, achieving both the SDGs and the objective of Paris Agreement require us to embody SDG 17 to catalyze finance in common. We are the seed money to jumpstart the largest fund ever with the most noble target, empowering all humans, leaving no one behind, and safeguard our planet in a sustainable manner. MDBs, with their natural global reach and being representative of the variety of stakeholders, will surely be key partner in making market work for development. In few weeks, the group of MDBs will showcase in a joint publication our contribution to SDGs that I am sure you will find informative.
Thank
At the start of the decade of action, we are here today to say it is time, we can do it, and let us achieve this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Dr. Hajar. And now let's watch a video of the message from Werner Hoyer, the President of the European Investment Bank.
Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues, ladies and gentlemen. Since the historic agreements struck in 2015, we development banks have been retooling our institutions to meet the challenges we face collectively, to help nations deliver on their sustainable development goals, and to slow the dangerous increase in emissions and global temperatures that threaten life on Earth as we know it. We know that today we are entering a critical decade. It is not too late to prevent catastrophic climate change and the resulting human misery that it would bring. I repeat, it is not too late, but we need brave actions now. The European Investment Bank will align all its financing with the objectives of the Paris Agreement by the end of this year. We will partner with others to be an incubator for finance, knowledge and ideas, driving a global transition to net zero. The COVID crisis has reminded us all how fragile life can be and the importance of working together. The bonds of partnership must be strengthened now, based on shared values and principles. Brave leadership and tough choices are needed. We owe this to the next generation.
Thank you very much to all of you for your contributions and for stressing once again your will to reorient global finance towards SDGs. So to this end, and to succeed this shift towards green and sustainable finance, we also know that we have to embark not only the public development banks, but all stakeholders who all feel responsible and accountable to reach the 2030 agenda. As President Hoyer just said, the private sector, the civil society, the foundations, local authorities, international organizations have the power to change the narrative. It's not too late if we act together. So what role PDBs and its global coalition should play to accelerate the alignment of all financial flows with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs? What is the best way to leverage each actor's expertise and contribution? So for this panel, I would like to welcome our next speakers who will voice their contributions to this global endeavor. So with us today, we have Akinwumi Adesina, Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, who will deliver a keynote on the specific African context. We also have Ms. Kate Hampton, CEO of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Ms. Yara Pietrikowski, Chair of Forest International, representing the civil society, and Mr. John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to all of you. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So my first question goes to Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the AFDB, the African Development Bank. So we know that your institution is a platform of knowledge and cooperation for other PDBs in the region. How do you see your role in supporting the networking, among the African PDBs, and more broadly in supporting the regional integration of all types of actors?
Well, let me start first by thanking President Macron and the UN Secretary General Guterres for hosting us for this Paris Peace Forum. I'd like to also thank my dear friend Remirio for the vision and the leadership in putting all this together for the Financing Common Summit with the public development banks. Well, let's all be clear. Peace is, of course, the collateral for sustainable development. We gather today for peace and for development. But we gather at a time of great challenges from the global coronavirus pandemic. Our gathering in Financing Common shows again today our collective resolve to keep our focus on sustainable development, even in the face of this pandemic. Clearly, nothing can dampen our collective resolve to provide better opportunities for all and to create hope for millions of youth to end extreme poverty and to provide better, safer, and of course, healthier future for all. Meeting the SDGs will be much tougher, of course, in Africa and everywhere today with the pandemic. Globally, the financing gap for the SDGs by 2030, we said it was $2.5 trillion per year. And that's, of course, been worsened by the pandemic. So we all now need to put our hands together and journey together. The public development banks, as Remy Rio was saying, with lending volumes of $2.3 trillion annually, they actually can meet 92% of all the financing gap for the SDGs. But just imagine, if those resources were well leveraged, the private sector, and aligned with the climate agenda, we can actually meet and exceed the SDGs and the climate financing agendas. So to mobilize the financing for SDGs, I think we just need to do three things. We need financing coalition, we need financing complementarity, and we need financing consolidation. The public development banks are such a powerful platform for this. If we can focus and align, that's where we are today. Let's be bold, let's be creative, let's build this new ecosystem for transformative change. And in the case of Africa that you mentioned, we are fully committed at African Development Bank to supporting Africa to meet its sustainable development goals and the climate agenda as agreed at COP21. We've been very responsive in the current situation with this pandemic. We launched a $10 billion facility to support Africa to contain the coronavirus. We also launched a $3 billion fight COVID-19 social bond on the global market, the largest ever social bond in world history. So yes, we are tackling the pandemic with saving lives. We're committed to supporting economic recovery to build African economies back stronger, bolder, better, with greater resilience. But we must continue to realize that the major focus for Africa must continue to be closing Africa's massive annual infrastructure financing gap, estimated at $68 to $108 billion. To advance this, the public development banks should invest in private sector infrastructure. I believe strongly that PPPs must become now the norm for infrastructure financing to reduce what we have right now as infrastructure-related debts. We must leverage more foreign direct investments to Africa. And for this, the Africa Investment Forum is Africa's structured investment marketplace and leveraging platform. We started it 2 years ago. And the Africa Investment Forum has attracted $78.1 billion of investment interest to Africa in just 2 years. So it's time for public development banks to all join hands with the African Development Bank and its partners so that we can create a massive investment rebound. We need that for Africa. Of course, the next forum will be held in South Africa in November of 2021. Now, we must leave no one behind. For that, of course, we must also prioritize financing to go to fragile states, in particular, the private sector in fragile states. We must also collectively address the huge financing gap for women. Development promise without women is simply an empty promise. Financing gap for women in Africa today is $42 billion. We launched a program called AFAWA, Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, to unlock $5 billion in financing for women over the next 5 years. I would like to thank President Macron for his great help in launching this and mobilizing substantial financing through the G7 when we had the Biodiversity Summit in France. As of June this year, $138 million has been approved for women in 7 countries by 10 financial institutions. So it's time for public development banks to join this largest effort ever to tilt financing towards women in Africa. I also should say something about Africa with regard to the youth. The African Development Bank now is working with governments to launch what I call youth entrepreneurship investment banks to create a new scalable, systemic, and sustainable financial ecosystem for unlocking entrepreneurship and growing businesses of the youth. The goal is to spur youth-led innovation, business ventures, create quality, decent jobs, and migration all over the place, and turn Africa's youth demographic advantage into assets for Africa. So I'd like to ask public development banks and colleagues here to join us in this new bold effort for Africa, including innovations that we can do to expand local capital markets. Finally, let me say, we must accelerate renewable energy all across Africa. You can't have development without energy. That's why we have, Light Up and Power Africa as one of our major strategies. The African Development Bank, of course, we no longer finance coal projects. Coal is gone. The bank has embarked on Desert to Power. This is a powerful initiative to build the world's largest solar zone in the Sahel. And that will provide electricity for 280 million people. It's a $20 billion investment in the Sahel. And that will require financing coalition, complementarity, and consolidation. I'd like again to call on all our colleagues in the public development banks, the civil society, the philanthropic organizations, my panel members, who all join the bank and others in this transformative effort to power Africa. So in closing, I'd just like to say that let's do financing common. Let's have financing coalition. Let's have financing complementarity. And let's have financing consolidation. It would be great to work together in all of this. So I think it's a great time. Let's just get it going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akinwumi Adesina, for this hopeful, enthusiastic message. So now we would like to listen to the representatives of the private sector, the foundations and the civil society, and hear their views on how they can contribute to the missions on the coalition. So Yara Pietrikowski, as the chair of Forest International, you empower civil society for effective social change. What role do you think the civil society can play in this movement?
First of all, Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, thank you for the invitation to be in this very important debate. Today, I'm representing not only Forus, the international network of national NGO platforms, but a very wide and diverse set of civil society organizations working on climate, environment, sustainable development, biodiversity, human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, gender, development, finance, and other topics. In your question, you highlighted something very important that was at the center of our discussion in preparation of this summit: the need to include civil society in PDBs. Yes, these may require tough and bold decisions, but this is the kind of leadership that we need. We cannot let ourselves be bullied by those who want to put profit before people, right? Let me explain what I mean by that. First, we should rethink development finance. We need to first and foremost increase, but also restructure financing for development so that all investments are consistent with a model of development that builds resilient societies, responds to communities' needs, and protects ecosystems. The PDB's policies should be effectively coherent and aligned with all international agreements, such as Paris Agreement and 23rd Agenda, human rights agreements, and so on. To do that, you need transparency and a meaningful participation in policy and decision-making processes. The governance structures of PDBs must include civil society. Participation and transparency are key for a democratic governance. It would be important to create mechanisms within the governance of the bank to ensure that civil society participation happens not only at project level, but also to be part of the approval process of the bank strategies. We are all living the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, there is a global debt crisis that was looming right now. 44% of low-income countries were already in or at risk of debt distress, even before the pandemic. You have to provide debt relief for these countries, mobilize a very rapid and truly major influx in public financing as part of COVID-19 just recovery measures, or we will pay the consequences of this inaction. Secondly, PDBs must fully embrace that sustainable development cannot be achieved without full respect for human rights. Public development banks, as state-owned institutions, have the obligation to respect and protect human rights in their policies and operations. PDBs can seize opportunities by centering rights-based approaches and community-led development in their programs. This also means ensuring full and free participation and respect for the right to free, prior and informed consent for indigenous peoples and local communities in all activities and projects. PDBs should respond to the public interest and increase funding for public health services, education, housing, sanitation policies, and so on. Third and last point, the urgency to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. To this date, PDBs from G20 countries have provided 3 times more finance for fossil fuels as for clean energy per year. And this trend has not diminished since Paris Agreement was signed. It typically benefits multinational corporations over local populations. PDB should exclude fossil fuels from their financing, and by the end of 2021, phase out all support for fossil fuels already in the pipeline. In doing so, they also should promote just transition plans developed with affected workers and communities. PDB should scale up investments for universal access for affordable, reliable, and renewable energy. PDBs also have a special role to play in making up for shortfall of finance for adaptation and to mobilize new additional finance to address losses and damages. In addition, it is very important to PDBs play a role in supporting the transition to more sustainable and resilient agricultural practices, such as agroecology, and shift to healthier diets. It will be necessary for a holistic approach. In conclusion, civil society have detailed a number of recommendations to PDBs in a joint statement that you can find on the Forum's website and that we'll be happy to share with the banks participating in this summit. What is clear is that achieving SDGs, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by fully implementing the Paris Agreement and protecting nature should be the key drivers of action and part of PDBs over coming decade. We know that this is the spirit of why all PDBs are joining forces at the summit. But you need to move fast and to ensure that specific commitments and action follow suit. And we stand ready to work with you and engage in that regular and in-depth dialogue between PDBs and civil society, which you mentioned, so that these guiding lights and these ethical approaches become reality.
Yara?
It's up to you. Yes?
Thank you.
I'm finishing?
Yes, just quick
finishing.
word. Unfortunately, we're very running out of time. Thank you.
I would like just to finish saying that It's up to you to be in the right side of the history. And seldom before have these words run so true. Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. Such a strong energy and determination. It's good to see. So I'm turning now to John Denton, how the private sector can leverage the coalition.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be part of this discussion, and a big shout out to Remy for bringing everything together. It's great to be in Paris in number 2 confinement as we battle COVID-19, and as an Australian in Paris, I'm battling through. We'll see how we go. Listen, perhaps I could put it a little bit differently. I mean, as you know, the International Chamber of Commerce is the institutional voice of the real economy. We are the representative voice of 45 million businesses globally, in the North and the South, developing countries, developed countries. We don't actually represent one sector, we represent all sectors. And nothing has been truer than the need to have a voice of the real economy in global policy settings in the midst of COVID-19, which, putting aside and actually being deeply respectful of the human consequences, the actual devastation that's been inflicted upon the real economy and continues to be inflicted is actually so severe that we cannot allow the context in which we operate to not be fully recognized. This is a very dire time for the real economy, and we want and we believe that public development banks can play a role. If I can just articulate in Seriatim 3 areas. The first is we want you to help us save our SMEs and save the real economy. We are pushing very hard on that. The second, and I think we have to be very frank here about the context in which we operate, we need your help to bring an end to this stage of the pandemic. And thirdly, yes, in the context of the Paris Peace discussions, in the context of Sustainable Development Goals and climate change, we actually want to work with you to drive sustainability and bend international global finance to be much more supportive of that. If I can just deal with them one by one. On this issue of saving our SMEs, I think we need to acknowledge that the outlook for the global economy is increasingly uncertain. And SMEs are expected to remain highly reliant on short-term loans and working capital facilities to remain solvent well into 2021. I heard the speaker from the African Development Bank yesterday. I hosted a discussion with all the ICC network in sub-Saharan Africa, which is something like 100 chambers of commerce, plus all our national committees. One issue became very, very clear, that the SMEs and micro SMEs, despite best endeavours, are actually struggling. They are struggling because credit conditions are tightening as default risks increase, and we are deeply concerned that the supply of bank finance will be insufficient to meet the liquidity needs of small businesses in the coming months, and that's globally. This is particularly the case as regards the supply of trade finance, a vital source of working capital for many SMEs, which underpins upwards of 80 to 90% of global trade. All available pointers are leading towards the contours of a widespread challenge in terms of access to trade finance for SMEs in the next little while. And that's, we know, that is an important source of trade credit to SMEs themselves. And that's particularly in emerging markets. And of course, this mirrors the trends we saw in previous crises. So absent proactive interventions of suitable scale to backstop provision of commercial banks, shortages of trade finance will prove a fatal blow to the survival of many small firms, starving them of essential liquidity and cutting off commercial opportunities as demand returns to the economy. And while we welcome the interventions made by governments and development banks to date, these are likely, and we suspect they will be insufficient to meet the US $2 trillion gap which is emerging, the contours which we can see right now, which will be needed to restore cross-border commerce to pre-pandemic levels. So we need to see public development banks given the resources to scale the support they can provide for essential forms of credit for the real economy, and crucially, given renewed mandates to take on more risk to better reach SMEs in desperate need of liquidity. That's the first area. The second, as I said, the context in which we operate. We need to work together to bring the acute phase of the pandemic to an end. We're delighted with the positive news on vaccine trials from pharmaceutical companies. The bigger challenge may lie ahead, though, in getting enough doses and manufactured and distributed to achieve global herd immunity, global treatment. Some of you may know that I participate on the COVAX Act A council, which has been put together by the President of the European Union and the head of the WHO. We're the private sector voice, and I'm the private sector participant there. What we're trying to do is work with WHO to get governments to commit the billions needed to secure supplies for developing markets. But huge amounts of finance will be needed to power the supply chains needed to manufacture the billions of doses and related equipment that will be needed. It's clear that there's a vital role here for public development banks to support the effective functioning of future vaccine supply chains. It's great to see the initial response.
It's absolutely, John. It's a very hopeful message indeed. We still have one other speaker, so I have to be the timekeeper here, but it's a very hopeful message. Thank you for sharing. So I will now move on to Ms. Hampton as the head of a major foundation. How do you picture the contribution of the foundations to enforce, this global movement?
Thank you very much to Remy as well. The Finance in Commons Summit is very timely. We face a global crisis in public finance, which could severely limit the ability of many countries to meet basic needs and certainly to achieve the SDGs and solve the climate crisis. So as the CEO of the largest philanthropy in the world dedicated to children, we fund work on child health and development, education, and work on the climate crisis. I feel the urgency every day because children are fast becoming the collateral damage of our COVID response. Whether it's missed vaccinations or missed schooling, the rise of teenage pregnancy, the increase in child marriage and child trafficking, as well as the intergenerational burden of climate and environmental destruction as we continue to pour taxpayers' money into the pockets of high carbon and resource-hungry incumbents, instead of funding the future and retraining the COVID jobless. But happily on climate, we're now entering a unique window of opportunity because many governments, businesses, and non-state actors are now aligning around a net zero emission vision of the future, which is a transformative vision. So incrementalism is no longer a viable strategy. And with all countries aligned on the long term, we now need to focus our attention on accelerating progress in the short term. Public development banks should follow suit and set their own targets, as well as near-term transition plans. This must include phasing out of coal and oil and gas, as we've heard, but combined with plans to support the affected workers and communities. Public development banks have an essential role to play in tackling our crises, multiple crises, but no single source of financing is going to do it. We need 2.5 trillion just for emerging economies. The new UN ECHA Action Plan for Africa sets out a good roadmap of financial reforms, and philanthropy can play a role in supporting this as well as other initiatives. First, we support the civil society ecosystem, which PDBs need to work with to address key societal challenges. Second, we can work with private financiers to foster the necessary innovation amongst banks and investors and make them genuine partners for change. Many philanthropies have their own endowments and are themselves big asset owners. Like others, CIF has divested from fossil fuels many years ago. We can also, as philanthropy, cultivate expertise and promote best practice sharing in areas like energy systems modeling, climate and nature policy, and just transition. So I'd like to propose today some specific areas where philanthropy and public development banks can work together. First, in developing and scaling up innovative blended finance solutions, which will bring private capital together with the expertise and outcome delivery of public development bank financing. Second, we need enhanced partnerships for SDG delivery, multi-stakeholder partnerships. And through this collaboration, we can bring together all financial market players, governments, central banks, regulators, private investors, and civil society to provide the expertise and the support that governments need to deliver the SDGs and tackle the climate and nature crisis. Just one illustration, if you take the proposed just transition transaction of South Africa that the government presented last year at UNGA, this is an area of potential natural partnership for public development banks and philanthropy. We can work together to tackle the challenges of rapidly transitioning South Africa's energy sector to renewable energy in the context of very challenging financing conditions, while raising the quality and breadth of employment and land rights and meeting environmental goals. The role that philanthropy can play is in the provision of independent public interest technical expertise in key sectors and supporting blended finance instruments. We can also help public development banks to address the climate and employment dimensions of South Africa's transition. And that's just one example amongst many. Let's get specific. Let's move with urgency. We want to work with you, for example, in the context of the upcoming G7 and G20s next year, alongside COP26 and CBD, to drive this agenda forward. The joint declaration has the right goals, and we're absolutely proud to endorse it and offer our full commitment to work with you to achieve its aims.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Hampton. Thank you very much to all of you for your observations and for sharing your convictions and your hopes for the future. It's truly inspiring, actually, to listen to all of them. Thank you very much. Remy, so over to you to conclude our session today.
No, thanks to you all. This is exactly what Finance in Common, what our joint declaration mean, not the public banks by themselves, but really working together like never. So today we are kicking off the movement with the first summit, but there will be a second summit next year to move forward with Akin, Yara, Kate, John, and all the participants. And now, Asha, I will turn to the UN,
Absolutely.
Secretary General for his concluding remarks, and I'm confident that he will support, that he will urge us to persevere and to reach results to fix the world.
Thank you, Remy.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this year, amid the pandemic that affects lives and livelihoods worldwide, we mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement and the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. These two agendas go hand in hand. The decisions we make now will determine the course of the next 30 years and beyond. Let me start with climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions must fall by half by 2030 and reach net zero emissions no later than 2050 to reach the 1.5 degrees goal. Science is clear. If we fail to meet these goals, the disruption to economies, societies and people caused by COVID-19 will pale in comparison to what the climate crisis holds in store. And so, our shared responsibility is equally clear. Redouble our efforts to recover from the economic and social crisis and get on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and build a sustainable, inclusive and resilient future. This will require an unprecedented mobilization by all of us. Global solidarity is imperative to defeat the virus and recover better. I'm encouraged by the growing number of countries committing to the net zero target. The European Union has pledged to become the first carbon-neutral continent by 2050 and has aligned its COVID-19 recovery package with that objective. The United Kingdom, Japan and the Republic of Korea, together with more than 110 other countries, have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050, and China has pledged to get there before 2060. This means that 50% of the world's gross domestic product and about 50% of global carbon dioxide emissions are now covered by a net zero commitment. This coalition of governments, joined by many cities and businesses, is growing in strength because leaders from around the world understand we have no alternative and because they recognize the opportunities that are there to be seized. But we are not there yet. No such bold commitments have yet been made to mobilize the finance necessary to achieve the net zero commitment by 2050, nor more broadly, the Sustainable Development Goals. Public development banks are uniquely positioned to play a leading role in this transformation, and I am encouraged by our stance towards the Sdgs and the Paris Agreement during this summit. You can provide concessional finance where it's most needed and leverage private finance for a shift of the whole financial system. This is essential to reboot our economies and put them firmly on the path to a carbon-neutral, sustainable future. We know what needs to be done. Let me highlight 5 key steps. First, the mandates of public development banks need to be aligned with commitments to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Setting climate finance targets is not enough. In 2019, multilateral development banks set a collective target of at least 65 billion by 2025, with 50 billion targeted to low and middle-income countries and an increase in adaptation finance of 18 billion, all US dollars. The African Development Bank allocated half of its climate finance to adaptation in 2019, an important step in the right direction. But more is needed from all and faster. I urge ministers of finance who shape the strategic direction of national, regional and multilateral development finance institutions to ensure that by COP26 all these institutions agree to align their policies and portfolios with the 1.5 degrees goal and the SDGs, and that all investments take into account climate risk and are climate resilient. I also ask all public development banks to commit to exit from coal, domestically and abroad, and urgently phase out fossil fuel finance, and call on all governments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies with clear time-bound targets and plans. Invest instead in just transition programs that will leave no one behind, including SDG bonds, and incorporate gender and sustainability in all instruments. A thorough rethinking of the mobilization potential, particularly by multilateral development banks, should be promoted urgently. I also ask development finance institutions to collaborate and scale up programs and financial vehicles that work, including to support countries that urgently need liquidity for recovery plans. Second, public development banks need to do more to meet urgent needs in the face of dramatic falls in private flows and public revenue. There is enormous demand for emergency funding with simplified approval processes guaranteeing fast access to finance. Priority must be given to finding immediate relief measures, notably on public health and food security. Ministers of Finance must recapitalize public development banks wherever necessary. To support the shift of private finance and private investment in developing countries to make it low carbon and climate resilient, public development banks can play a very important role in de-risking by providing adequate guarantees or through other mechanisms, including taking first loss positions. Indeed, investments by public development banks have been shown to bring in more private finance instead of replacing it, as often feared. Such investments also offer opportunities to improve governance and regulatory frameworks in the countries where they operate, providing certainty and bringing in much-needed capital. Third, public development finance needs to dramatically increase support for adaptation and resilience, particularly for the most vulnerable groups. Today, more than 93% of all climate finance goes to emission reduction efforts. While adaptation finance from multilateral development banks has been growing, it is still just 23% of all such funding. We need to move from small-scale adaptation finance to large-scale preventive and systematic adaptation support. This means a dramatic increase in concessional finance. It also means combating inequalities between and within countries. By reducing exposure of the most vulnerable to climate change, we enhance resilience for all. And to reduce inequalities, we need to invest massively in public health, food security, and education for all, in empowering women, girls, and the most vulnerable, in supporting productive investment and employment, in access to energy, and in promoting human rights in general. Fourth, we need more transparency to ensure that all finance, public and private, supports the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. I urge countries to work together to adopt norms, standards, and certification mechanisms for sustainable finance. And I call on public development banks to adopt these tools to report on their success in aligning their own finance and all the private finance they have mobilized with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. I ask all financial authorities, including central banks and financial regulators, to incorporate climate risk in your functions and make climate-related financial disclosures mandatory. Some central banks and regulators are already taking decisive steps, including in Brazil and New Zealand. Fifth, we need better data. We need public development banks to invest in the data and statistics that strengthen the capacity of developing countries to make the decisions that are needed. And we need public development banks to openly share their data with decision makers for better coordinated action. Excellencies, the decisions you make will send a signal to the global financial community and to policymakers around the world. You can lead the way in transforming our approach to development finance. You can help build the foundations of a new economy fit for the 21st century. I thank you for sending that urgent message today and count on you to come to the Climate Ambition Summit on December 12th and COP26 next year with concrete plans to realize our vision of a carbon-neutral, resilient, inclusive and sustainable world. Thank you.
you.